The cockpit was flooded with a warning signal that indicated engine failure. My veins filled with adrenaline as I struggled to restart the engine while I went through the emergency checklist of my Cessna 172. After several attempts, I failed to get any mechanical response and resorted to contacting air communications. Nothing but static. I was flying a plane with no power, losing altitude. I scanned the ocean of trees ahead for a clearing in which I could bring my plane down safely. My GPS had become disoriented and was shifting directions repeatedly. I knew this was going to end badly. I remembered my training. Although I've covered this type of scenario several times over, actually experiencing it firsthand was a terrifying new experience. The clouds above became darker. A heavy wind blew in from the north, which caused me to descend at a dangerous rate. I saw an opening of trees that gave promise, but there was no chance I could manage to safely meet the ground. I went for it anyways. Heavy rain peppered my windshield, obscuring my vision. And this is when I realized I've lost all power to my vessel and was now flying a giant paper airplane. I lined up my landing as best I could and hoped for the best. I was about 50 feet from the ground when a tree collided with my left wing and completely tore it from the plane. That's when I knew I was in deep shit and sinking down like lead. I embraced myself for impact. Whiplash sent me into a state of disarray. Shattered glass pierced my skin. Rain broke through and hit me like a tidal wave. The moment my plane contacted the ground, I blacked out. A sharp pain in my side pulled me back to consciousness. I could hear roaring flames and the crackling of burning wood. But my vision took a bit of time to fully return. I undid my harness and reached down to identify the source of my pain. It felt like glass. And indeed, it was. But it didn't feel deep enough to be fatal. I slowly removed the shard that protruded from just below my ribcage. And then I felt a warm trail of blood leak from the opening. Holding pressure onto the wound, I squirmed out of the cockpit, making sure to grab the first aid kit, only to see the wreckage that laid before me. My plane was destroyed. Fuel had spilled from the tanks and filled the air with its pungent odor. Something had caused the fuel to ignite, but it was slowly being extinguished by the heavy rainfall. A sense of dread washed over me as I came to the realization that not only had I crashed, but I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. Even from above, in every direction, there were only trees and cascading mountains that stretched far beyond my view. My radio was destroyed. Most of my belongings were trapped inside that plane, which was completely engulfed in flames. I barely even managed to escape with only light injuries. And if I'd taken a moment longer, I would have been burned alive. Once the rain had put out the flames, I salvaged what I could from the wreckage. It wasn't much. Thunder roared as I struggled to dress my wound and proceeded to create some sort of shelter out of the remnants of my vessel in order to protect myself from the harsh weather. By the time I'd finished, it was already nightfall. I wandered around the woods and gathered as much dry wood as I could possibly find in the dark. Using the tools in my first aid kit, I managed to get a fire going and was able to keep warm enough to fall asleep. A faint cough woke me from my slumber. I stirred a bit, adjusting my body for comfort. And then I heard it again. This instantly grabbed my attention. The sound came from the other side of the fire. I opened one eye, hoping that whatever had made that sound didn't realize it had woken me. Terror coursed through my veins as I saw what had invaded my shelter. It was the silhouette of what looked like a man, hunched over and mumbling something unintelligible to itself. The figure seemed completely nude, skinny, and unusually tall. I did my best not to move. The last thing I wanted was to provoke the creature. I watched it for a while, analyzing its odd movement. It seemed to be trying to warm itself, only it was more fascinated by the fire, if I had to guess. It kept far enough from the fire to where I couldn't pinpoint any distinct features, other than what I could identify from its outline. This went on for quite some time. The human-like creature rocked back and forth, mumbling to itself in some strange way that I couldn't understand. I was confused. But most of all, I was disturbed. I was supposed to be in a remote section of the northern wilderness. There were no known inhabitants of this area, and it was strictly a no-land zone. Whatever resides in those woods are far from human. I did my best to mask my breathing. Any signs of consciousness could have drawn the creature's attention away from the fire and over to me. It seemed mesmerized by the crackling of uncured wood and the red glow of the charred wood beneath the dying flame. An itch. A sensation that you'd get when you're lying in your bed and you suddenly are struck with the paranoia of a spider or other unwanted presence crawling up your leg. Your mind naturally wants you to reach and assure that it's just your nerves playing tricks on you. But you still smack the area anyways, hoping that if it were a spider, you'd put it to rest. This was a scenario much like that, but I couldn't indulge in those acts. I was tortured by the unrelenting worry that some arachnid had decided to explore the confines of my body, all of which was going on while I was in the presence of something far worse. Yet my mind stayed focused on the subtle tickling feeling that slowly made its way up my leg and just inches away from my groin. It took every ounce of self-control a man could muster to stop myself from shoving my hand down my pants and ridding myself of its intruder. Soon enough, the flame had died down to just the red glow of the charred wood. The creature suddenly snapped back into reality, and its neck cracked into a 90-degree turn while facing towards me. The glowing embers reflected in its abnormally large eyes as it stared directly at me. I stopped breathing altogether. The itch had been long forgotten, and the only thought that was present in my mind was the hope that it hadn't noticed I was awake. It took a step towards me, tilting its head from side to side in an animalistic way. The creature gave the appearance of a man, yet I saw no genitalia, just smooth, stone-like skin in place of where it should be. I shut my eyes and expected the worst. The snapping of branches broke the silence, and I could hear a loud snort rise from the creature's throat, followed by rapid footsteps, fleeing from my presence. After a few moments of what I thought were my last, I opened my eyes one by one, only to see the creature had vanished. The forest was silent once again, other than the crackling of the fire's remains. That night, I didn't rest. I laid there in silence, jumping at any sound that emitted from the darkness beyond the trees. Anxiety had consumed me for the night, and in my physical state, I was in no shape to defend myself. A few days went by, and I'd seen no other signs of that strange creature. I spent most of what daylight I had collecting firewood and salvaging parts of the plane's wreckage to build myself a more suitable shelter. During the evenings, I'd relentlessly attempt to make any human contact via the radio, but to no avail. I started to become depressed. I felt as if I was going to die in those woods. Alone, forgotten, and knowing that not a single person knew where I was. I was just a tiny speck in an ocean of trees that made it nearly impossible to find me. Even if I had managed to build a fire large enough to be seen from overhead, I could be leading that creature right back to my camp. Or worse, there could be even more of them. I did my best not to think about that night. It wouldn't do me any good. I tried to stay focused, get familiar with my surroundings, find clean water, and hope that I hadn't steered too far off course that search and rescue couldn't find me. But that soon became the least of my worries. About a week later, I was out collecting water from a creek I'd found about 5 miles away from my campsite when I spotted something out of place. At first, I thought it was a hallucination. I rubbed my eyes and blinked several times until realizing that it was exactly what I had seen. Perched on the branch of a tree just a few feet out of arm's reach was a video camera. What the hell is that doing here? I said to myself out loud. A wire ran down from the camera along the base of the tree and directly into the ground. I tore at the dirt with my bare hands in a fury, hoping to trace it back to its source. But there was no luck. I only managed to get a foot or two into the ground before I hit solid concrete. That's right, concrete. The type you'd use to make a sidewalk or a set of stairs, with the wire from the camera leading directly into it. That was when I nearly broke down. I thought I was going mad. I first started to sob, and that soon turned into a blinding rage. I leapt up and grabbed a low-hanging branch on the tree, pulling myself up high enough to grab the device, and tossed it to the ground. After that, I proceeded to smash the camera to pieces, only to realize I'd wasted precious daylight and was not going to be able to make it back to camp before sundown. I had a strict rule that I would never explore the woods after dark. Each night, I would fall asleep while anxiously watching the line of trees, hoping that the creature I'd seen on my first night wouldn't decide to come back. There were many times that I'd contemplated killing myself, putting an end to my misery. But I'd always reflect on something my father once said to me as a child. Giving up is for cowards. If you don't give it 100%, you're nothing more than that. I wouldn't be who I am today if I had given up. You wouldn't be here today. You were a miracle, son. The doctors told me you wouldn't live past the first 6 months. But here you are, alive and well. And that's proof that anything is possible, no matter the circumstance. Remember that. My father was a wise man and an experienced pilot, one of the best. My mother passed away when I was 5 and left my father and I to fend for ourselves. If there was ever such a thing as tough love, my father was the epitome of it. But he was also a very caring man. No matter what the circumstance, he'd make sure he'd get the job done. Lives depended on him. My father was responsible for delivering medical supplies to refugee camps during World War II. These camps were often inaccessible to any land vehicle, so to supply the medical teams on site, they'd require an airdrop that was more risky since they were located behind enemy lines. My father was a great man. Even after the war, he'd use his resources to help as many people as he could, up until the day he died. Even though I didn't want to follow in his footsteps and become a pilot myself, but instead a journalist, he was always supportive. But things changed after I'd been notified that he passed away in his sleep from cardiac arrest. I quit my job. I moved back to Alaska and made the decision to become a pilot in honor of his name. I loved my father, and he was the only family that I had left. So once he was gone, I was alone. And there I was, about 5 miles away from camp and losing daylight, fast. If you've ever seen a man run for his life, then you can imagine what I looked like, jumping over fallen trees, being whipped by branches that I didn't care to avoid. I was set on making it back to camp as soon as possible, before I got lost in the dark, ominous woods that held mysteries far beyond my imagination's capabilities. My heart kept pace with my legs, and my lungs worked just as hard as I navigated through the seemingly endless congregation of trees, until I was met by something so terrifying that to this day, it haunts me. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened. It was a sound I'd recognized from my first night there. That mumbling. Only this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was dozens of them. The voices drew nearer. My body, that once was burning hot with adrenaline, was now cold as ice. I could hear the rustling of leaves underneath their footsteps, the collective voices that muttered endless phrases that I was yet able to identify. It all stopped once we made visual contact. A phalanx of what seemed like 50 or even more stood in front of me. They too were frozen in place. Each one's large, round eyes fixated on mine. My first instinct should have been to flee, but my legs were locked in place. There wasn't much anywhere I could go. I was greatly outnumbered, and they stood at a height of easily 7 feet tall. This is when I got a much better look at what they were. Their skin was a stone gray. Their body was like ours, yet only in a slight sense. Long arms hung far below their waist, nearly stopping at their knees. No identifying genitals, no body hair. They had pale, smooth faces, but didn't have a nose, only 2 small, dime-sized holes instead. Their mouths were like a small, black slit, just a few inches below their nostrils, and it rapidly moved as it repeated the same words over and over. It was a sight that one could only imagine in their worst nightmares. Only mine wasn't. It was real. We stood there in a deadlock for at least 5 minutes until one of them took a step towards me, and in reaction, I took a step back. Then in unison, every other creature followed with a step forward as well. With each long step they took, I returned with another moving away. Their legs were a lot longer than mine, which in result allowed them to gain on me. I made the only choice I had at the time, and I ran. I spun on my heels and sprinted as fast as I could into the darkness. I had no direction, and my only thought in mind was to escape from those abominations' clutches. Above the sounds of my own feet smacking against the forest floor, I could hear the heavy wheezing and choir of unintelligible muttering from my pursuers. It only grew louder as I ran further into the woods, knowing that any moment they'd catch me. Adrenaline kept me going, but soon I noticed a few blinking lights scattered amongst the trees ahead. It didn't take long to realize that there were more of those cameras. Further examination revealed that it had not only been a few cameras. There were hundreds, even thousands of them, scattered all throughout the woods. It was as if you were peering into a clear night sky that was full of distinct stars and planets. Only that's what I'd wished I was seeing. They all blinked in unison as I blindly ran deeper into the woods, only to see that the ocean of lights didn't end. It just stretched out endlessly. I'd become so distracted that I didn't notice the large boulder in front of me. At the speed I was going, my body completely lifted from the ground, and my weight was thrown off balance, which sent me flying headfirst into a tree. As I laid there, hoping that my death would be quick and painless, I watched them gather around me, still repeating that same phrase. Their faces came closer and closer, then soon only inches away from my own. And that's when everything went black. A loud whirring and heavy gusts pulled me out of my unconscious state. I immediately recognized the source. Soon came several armed men in camouflage uniforms, who picked me up and carried me away. It was daylight then. I had no clue why I was still alive, nor how long had passed since my nasty spill. I was only conscious for a few moments until a sense of relief allowed me to drift back into darkness. I was awoken again by the sounds of medical machinery. I went to reach for my head, which was throbbing, only to see that I'd been restrained to the hospital bed by handcuffs. A man in uniform entered my room shortly after. I don't want to get into details, but I'll say that he interrogated me for hours, asking the same questions over and over. Why were you flying in restricted airspace? What did you see? Were there any passengers? I lied about what I'd seen, knowing it would only get me into more trouble. I didn't have any passengers, which would have been obvious if they found the wreckage since I was flying alone. They didn't believe me at first, and had me detained for several days, until they finally took me home. But not after forcing me to sign an agreement that would not release any information about my weeks in the woods. I don't know what kind of experiments they had going on in that place. I don't think I really want to know. All that I can say is that I will not be staying around here much longer. They may come looking for me after writing this, but I had to get it out. Maybe it'll settle my anxiety. I feel as if I'm under constant surveillance, and I'm hoping it's just paranoia. Whatever the case may be, I'm leaving this for you to decide, as I have an appointment with a man about a plane.